Good morning, beautiful people.
Good morning.
My name is Troy LaRaviere, and it is an honor to be here in the words of Dr. King in this magnificent house of worship. Thank you so much to the Community Renewal Society for the invitation. I consider myself to be somewhat of a connoisseur of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King's speeches. And one of Dr. King's, what I believe his greatest speech, his most impactful speech, is his speech at the end of the march from Selma to Montgomery. I believe that if that speech, a particular part of that speech, was celebrated and taught as much as I have a dream, we might have a different world. And so I want to talk a little bit about that speech and its implications. In that speech, he was making the point that after slavery, there was no segregation, black people could vote, and that the populist movement had organized poor black and white workers into a voting bloc that could drive the wealthy who were exploiting them from power. And then he got into this part where he began to explain how they responded to this movement. And he says, these are Dr. King's words, to meet this threat, they engineered a segregated society. I want you to follow me through here because this is very important to see the roots of racism. They revised the doctrine of white supremacy through their control of the mass media. They saturated the thinking of the poor white masses with it, thus clouding their minds to the real issues. They made it a crime for Negroes and whites to come together at any level as equals, and that did it. That crippled and eventually destroyed the populist movement in the 19th century. If it may be said of slavery, of the slavery era, that the white man took the world and gave the Negro Jesus, then it may be said of the Reconstruction era that the Southern aristocracy took the world and gave the poor white man Jim Crow. And when the poor white man's wrinkled stomach cried out for the food that his empty pockets could not provide, he ate Jim Crow, a psychological bird that told him that no matter how bad off he was, at least he was a white man, better than the black man. And when his undernourished children cried out for the necessities that his low wages could not provide, he showed them the Jim Crow signs, and his children too learned to feed upon Jim Crow, their last outpost of psychological oblivion. Imagine a world where that was taught every January and throughout the year. The principles behind that. I would say to you today that many Americans helped put our current president in the White House in no small part because of their continued immersion in that same psychological oblivion. What we have to understand is that you can't enslave people for 250 years and then segregate them for another 100 years without the buy-in of a critical mass of the population. People won't accept it. They won't accept something if they believe they're being immoral and unethical. So you have to convince a critical mass of the population that this is okay to do to them. In order to do that, you have to tell a story about them. You have to tell a lie about them. You have to, in the minds of a critical mass, impugn the integrity of black character. Question the truth of black voices in the minds of the masses. Malign the intentions of black hearts. Disregard the worth of black lives and scoff at the mere mention or suggestion of holiness in a black soul in the minds of the masses. So in order to, as Dr. King said, saturate people's thinking with the lie of white supremacy, you must saturate their thinking with the lie of black inferiority. They're two sides of the same coin. the lie of black inferiority and the lie of black criminality. And that's what they went about the business of doing for 350 years, and they haven't stopped yet. Slavery can end. Slavery can end. Jim Crow can end, but you did not end the culture that was produced by the lie you told for 350 years. The culture is still there. And it's not just white people. Right? We were immersed in the same lie. Many of us hold the same beliefs about other people who look like us, the same beliefs that white people hold. Now, it's not conscious. We wouldn't say, for example, that we believe that most young black men are criminals, but we'll tense up in a room when a group of young black men walk in, just as much as white folk will tense up. Many of us will. It's part of the culture. We have been mined. I wish I wasn't in the church. We have been mined. So we have to somehow have some honest conversations about that, because these anti-black prejudices live in our citizens, in our institutions, in our elected officials, in our public servants, from teachers to police officers. Right. And right now I want to talk a little bit about my own encounters with police officers as a way to explore this. The anti-black prejudices that undergird racism and white supremacy. In 1986, I was punched in the gut and walked over by a half-dozen policemen at the Chicago Bears Super Bowl victory parade. In 1987, on the way to the Rainbow roller rink, I was stopped by a police officer with several of my friends, and with a gun to my head, told never to bring myself back to the north side and go back where we belonged. In 1991, I was arrested for using profanity. And the officer who arrested me, when he got me to the station, listened to me and said, "Oh, you one of those black revolutionaries." He said, "Y'all want a revolution, don't y'all? I can't wait till you have your revolution, Troy, because that's the day I'm going to get to shoot all of you down." In 2010, I had one of my most interesting experiences. I was an assistant principal at Johnson Elementary School, and I was on my way headed home. My son was about 3 years old. I wanted to get home to see him, and I have to admit, I might have ran a few orange lights. I have to admit, I may have been going a little fast. And this car pulls up, blocks me off. This blue truck blocks me off from out of the blue. Guy gets out, flashes the badge, comes over to my car, does this, flashes his gun as my window's down, and I look and go, "A gun for a I'm looking at him in there, "A gun for a traffic stop?" And he stops, and then he reaches into my car, pulls my keys out, and begins to berate me in the middle of traffic. And I'm looking, taking it, and I'm looking in my rearview mirror. Now I got my suit on, I'm an assistant principal, I got my suit on, I'm looking in the rearview mirror, and I see traffic is being backed up, and I said, "Officer, is it okay with you if I just pulled up a little bit to the side so these people can get by? You know, if it's all right with you, I ain't gonna go nowhere, officer, I promise. I just want to pull up so these people can get by." He stopped, and his eyes met mine. And he said, "I'm sorry, you're not who I thought you were. I'm sorry, you're not who I thought you were. I see you have your suit on, you're conscientious about the people behind you, I'm sorry." And he let me go. Who did he think I was? Who did he think I was? He thought I was exactly who he and everybody else in this country has been taught to think I've been their entire lives. That's who he thought I was, who he'd been trained to think I was. And that training didn't start in the police department. It started in our American culture. Think about that cop that followed me and my friends around and stopped us and put the gun to my head and said, "Don't come back here." What do you think he saw when he saw us driving? He saw a bunch of kids who he'd been conditioned to think will probably be robbing somebody tonight. And he felt righteous. He saw the same thing that George Zimmerman saw. What George had been taught to see. Now, we can be angry at George Zimmerman, and we certainly should be when George Zimmerman saw Trayvon Martin and what he felt. But we have to be angry at a society and a culture that produces thousands of George Zimmermans every single day. Now, one of my more interesting experiences with the police happened when I was returning some boxes, taking them to the UPS store. I had gotten out of my car in a small mini-mart, and the police saw me. Police was walking away from the store. I was walking toward the store, and he sees me, pauses, and looks as I'm walking. And then he stands there for a couple of seconds and then starts to walk toward me. And I'm thinking, oh, Jesus, what have I done now? What has he convicted me of in his mind now? I've already been guilty of celebrating the Super Bowl while black, going roller skating while black, using profanity while black, and now my latest crime was returning packages to the UPS store while black. And so I'm walking with these boxes. And he's trying to cut me off, it looks like. And we meet at the door, and he reaches out his hands, opens up the door, and says, "I thought you could use a hand. I thought you could use a hand." I was glad to be wrong, but there was a deeper lesson there. A simple way to look at it is, oh, this was a good cop and the other ones were bad cops. But is it so simple? Now, certainly the cops that punched me and walked over me and the one who said he can't wait to shoot us down need to be fired and locked away and never police anybody again for the rest of their days. But it seems to me that there are many officers for whom it's not so black and white. It seems to me that all of our thinking has been saturated with the lie of black inferiority and criminality. And that the same holds true for not just every police officer, but every public servant. Some have been impacted just a little bit, some a lot. But it's hard to live in this society and not be impacted by the lies that you're saturated in and day out. And so what we're faced with is, how do we purposefully and deliberately educate and train people so that they have more instances in which they reject their prejudices than succumb to their prejudices? And the key is that you can't reject your prejudices if you don't acknowledge them. We have to have an American equivalent to Alcoholics Anonymous. What's the first thing you have to do in Alcoholics Anonymous? You have to say, "I am an alcoholic." And together as a society, we have to say, I am prejudiced. We have to acknowledge that existence in us. Recognizing and rejecting our prejudices is incredibly important, because prejudice itself is not racism. Your prejudice becomes racism when you act on it. Your prejudice becomes racism when you act on it. If an officer with no evidence whatsoever suspects a black teen of having a weapon, that's prejudice. If he stops and frisks him, that's racism. If an elected official thinks 25% of black children won't amount to anything, that's prejudice. If that official shuts down dozens of their schools because of that belief, that's racism. You can't prevent prejudiced thoughts, but you can prevent your own prejudiced thoughts from becoming racist acts. These prejudices are often referred to as implicit bias. But if people are trained to recognize their prejudices and biases, it can dramatically reduce the instances of personal and institutional racism in policing, education, housing, hiring, and other aspects of public life. Of course, there are some people for whom no amount of anti-bias training will matter. However, for most people, I believe in Dr. King's way of looking at prejudice. In a speech he made the night before he was assassinated, he was talking about the threats on his life, and he said, "And then I got to Memphis, and some began to talk about the threats that were out. What would happen to me from some of our sick white brothers?" He didn't say wicked white brothers. He said sick white brothers, because he understood that prejudice is not an evil. It is an illness. There may be evil people who are prejudiced, but prejudice itself is not an evil. It is an illness, and an illness can be treated, cured, and healed. In conclusion, I believe that to some extent all of us hold prejudice, and we have to come face to face with the fact that all of our thinking is impacted to some degree by the lie of black criminality, the lie of Muslim violence, the lie of religious and other religious stereotypes, the lie of anti-immigration propaganda aimed at Latino people, the lie of sexist assumptions about and stereotypes about women, and the lie of homophobia. And as a result of the presence of these lies in our culture and our thinking, we are all to some extent sick, but we can all heal. And through the process of healing ourselves, we can create a blueprint for healing our institutions and healing our city. Thank you.